Ancient India is often described as a land of wisdom, spirituality, and learning. A civilization where knowledge was sacred, teachers were respected, and students lived disciplined lives in pursuit of truth. Modern discussions frequently portray this era as an educational ideal, a time when learning was pure and free from material corruption. But this image only survives if you ignore one uncomfortable reality. Education in ancient India was never equal, and if you were born poor, becoming a student did not mean enlightenment. It meant sacrifice, obedience, hunger, and exhaustion. For many, it meant giving everything and receiving almost nothing in return. To understand why it sucked to be a poor student in ancient India, we have to move past the romantic version of history and look at how education actually functioned on the ground. The most common form of formal education was the Gurukul system. Students lived with their guru, often in forests or remote settlements. The guru was not just a teacher, but a spiritual authority, moral guide, and absolute ruler of the household. Students followed strict routines from before sunrise until nightfall. Their lives were completely controlled. In theory, this system emphasized equality. Students wore simple clothes, ate basic food, and lived humble lives regardless of background. This simplicity is often mistaken for fairness. But simplicity does not erase inequality. For students from wealthy families, Gurukul life was controlled hardship. Their families could afford to support them for years. They could send food, clothing, offerings, and gifts. Their education was backed by resources, connections, and security. For poor students, the same system became a daily struggle just to survive. The first barrier was access. Education was not a right. Many forms of advanced learning were restricted by social class, lineage, and tradition. Even where restrictions were flexible, poverty itself acted as a wall. Poor families depended on their children for labor. Sending a child away meant losing income, food, or protection. For many families, education was not just expensive, it was dangerous. If a child did manage to enter a Gurukul, the cost shifted from the family to the child. Education was not free. Students were expected to repay their guru through service. Wealthy students often paid indirectly through gifts, donations, or future patronage. Poor students paid with labor. This labor was constant and physically demanding. Poor students collected firewood, often walking long distances through forests. They fetched water repeatedly throughout the day. They cleaned the hermitage, cooked meals, cared for animals, repaired structures, and ran errands. Many were sent to nearby villages to beg for food for the entire household. Only after work were lessons allowed. Learning was conditional. If duties were not completed, education could be withheld. Hunger became punishment. Exhaustion became normal. A poor student's body was part of the educational payment. This created a silent hierarchy inside the same school. Some students spent their days studying, debating, memorizing texts, and engaging with philosophy. Others spent their days working. Yet both were judged by the same academic expectations. Food scarcity made everything worse. Meals were simple for everyone, but scarcity never affected everyone equally. When food was limited, poor students suffered first. Their survival depended on obedience and charity. Hunger was not treated as a problem. It was reframed as discipline. Studying while hungry was considered a virtue. But hunger destroys learning. It weakens memory, slows comprehension, and drains motivation. Expecting intellectual excellence under constant hunger was unrealistic. But failure was blamed on the student, not the system. Discipline in ancient education was severe. The guru's authority was absolute. Questioning instructions was seen as arrogance. Disobedience was treated as moral failure. Punishments were meant to break ego, not correct mistakes. Physical punishment was common. Verbal humiliation was normalized. Public shaming was a teaching method. For wealthy students, discipline often remained symbolic. For poor students, it was personal. A missed chore, a forgotten verse, or a moment of exhaustion could lead to punishment. There was no protection, no appeal. Leaving the Gurukul was allowed in theory, but devastating in practice. Walking away meant returning home with nothing. There were no degrees, no certificates, no formal recognition. Education did not guarantee employment or status. It offered reputation, which depended heavily on lineage, patronage, and social networks. A poor student could study for years and still return to poverty unchanged. Even those who succeeded faced limits. Opportunities after education were shaped by birth. A brilliant poor student could still be overlooked in favor of a mediocre student with wealth or influence. Knowledge sharpened the mind but did not dismantle social hierarchy. In many cases, it reinforced it. Education became a system that rewarded endurance more than intelligence, obedience more than curiosity, silence more than questioning. Ancient texts praise the ideal student who submits completely, serves willingly, and accepts hardship without complaint. But those ideals were written from positions of comfort. For poor students, obedience was not philosophical, it was survival. Suffering was reframed as spiritual growth. Endurance was called enlightenment. Silence was mistaken for wisdom. Many students never completed their education. Exhaustion, hunger, punishment, and hopelessness drove them away. Their stories were rarely recorded. History remembers scholars, not those who failed quietly, and those who failed were blamed for failing. Poverty was treated as personal weakness, not structural disadvantage. Even worse were the consequences of resistance. Students who questioned authority, challenged traditions, or refused labor risked expulsion, punishment, or social disgrace. Reputation mattered more than truth. Once labeled disobedient, a student's future could be destroyed. Education was not about nurturing potential, it was about preserving order. Knowledge was sacred, but access was controlled. This is why the romantic image of ancient education is incomplete. Yes, ancient India produced extraordinary thinkers, but it also consumed generations of poor students whose potential never had space to grow. Their lives were shaped more by labor than learning, more by obedience than curiosity. Education was not liberation, it was a gamble taken under impossible conditions. A poor student's life revolved around survival, not discovery, around service, not exploration, around endurance, not opportunity. Modern ideas about equal access to education exist because systems like this failed so visibly. The suffering of those forgotten students is part of why education is now seen as something that should not depend on birth or wealth, because history already showed what happens when knowledge is locked behind endurance and obedience. For poor students in ancient India, school was not a path upward. It was a test of how much a child could endure before breaking, and most broke quietly. If this story feels uncomfortable, it should, because it reminds us that wisdom does not automatically mean justice, and education without access is simply another form of power. And this is only one part of the story. The lives of students who openly challenged the system were even harsher, and their consequences were far more severe.